2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Joining us in studio is University of Newcastle Professor of Physics, Mathematical and Physical Science and the head of the school there. It's Fred Menk. Fred, hello and welcome.
Good morning. Hello, how are you?
Look, I'm going pretty well. I've been thinking about our topic for today of space junk, and I was actually thinking to myself, well, I wonder how much junk there is up there. I've always been concerned with junk about the place, like mattresses in the bush and things like that. And then now you've got me worried about what's going on in outer space, Fred. Can you tell me more?
Yes, indeed. It's a very important form of junk, actually probably more so than mattresses in the bush, I have to say.
Really? Okay.
Yep.
It's very serious then.
So,
Why so?
Let me get the technical part out of the way first. So if we think about space and we think about where satellites are orbiting in space, basically they're in two types of regions. There's what's called low Earth orbit, which is 800 to 1,000 kilometres altitude. And then there's geostationary orbit, which is 36,000 kilometres altitude. Now, communication satellites are in geostationary orbit, and all the others are in low Earth orbit.
Can I ask a very basic question? Which one runs our GPS, Fred?
Oh, that's in between.
Okay,
That's at
all right.
20,000 kilometres, and that's a very special orbit with not much in it.
Okay, and that's potentially a good thing, I should imagine.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
So the low Earth orbit has thousands of spacecraft, but it also has a lot of junk,
Right.
and that's the problem area.
What is that junk? Is it things that have fallen off spacecraft in years gone by? What sort of stuff are we talking about?
It's all sorts of things. You'd be amazed. So when a spacecraft is launched, the rocket goes off, and the satellite is released in the past with explosive bolts. And so those bits of bolts which explode then fly off into space. And then there are other things like little bits that come off, even bits of paint that come off.
Okay.
They form junk. And in the past, there have been, even now when rockets are launched, many of them have solid fuel, and little lumps of that spent fuel gets ejected. And then there are other forms of junk which are due to explosions, due to man-made explosions. For example, during the Cold War, there were tests to see if it would be possible to destroy a satellite in space by blowing up another one near it.
Okay.
And so there were thousands and thousands and thousands of bits of junk that have been generated. In actual fact, if we think about bits of junk up to from 1 millimetre to 10 millimetres in size, so a centimetre, there's about 50 million bits of junk that size in low Earth orbit. Now, if you're hit by a piece of that junk, it's like being hit by a cricket ball at 100 kilometres an hour.
Wow, it'll kill you.
Yes.
If it got you in the right spot, obviously.
And it can cause real damage to other spacecraft.
Right.
So that's the problem.
Okay. So and that is where the level of concern comes in. Obviously there's concern because you're thinking, oh well, space, we don't want it to be polluted for those obvious reasons. But what is the main level of concern for you and what you're lecturing in?
So the concern is that we can't really clean it up.
Okay.
We don't know how to go there and collect all those pieces. That's the first concern. And then we're adding to it. And then there's a real concern, which is something called the Kessler syndrome. It sounds like a science fiction movie.
No.
But it's not. So the Kessler syndrome is based on a study that was done by a guy, by Kessler, some years ago. And what he looked at was what would happen when the amount of junk goes beyond a certain point. So what would happen is that you have enough junk that something will collide with a spacecraft, which then causes more junk, which then collides with more spacecraft and causes, so it's a runaway situation.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
And it's estimated we're probably about 20 years away from that runaway situation.
So we really do need to come up with a solution of, firstly, minimisation of the junk so that things aren't falling off and being expelled into space, so we're not creating it. We need to cease the creation of it as best we can. But then we also do need to... Do we need to figure out some way of collecting it or at least getting it? Is that at all possible, or is that just beyond realm of probability?
It's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. At this stage, collection is not possible. So what is happening is that governments are spending a lot of money, including the Australian government, surprisingly, to think about ways to mitigate. So what that means is you try and track as much of the junk as you can, and you look at where the junk is, and you look at your own spacecraft, and if there's some sort of a collision coming up, you try and move one or the other. The US has spent a lot of money on building such a surveillance program, and it's upgrading that. In actual fact, Australia is part of that surveillance program. There's a big radar station that in West Australia now that's part of that, to try and track the junk better, and to try and devise mechanisms to either deflect the junk or to move the spacecraft that it might collide with. And that includes a space station. The space stations had to be moved a few times to avoid bits of junk.
That's the International Space Station that we regularly see in our night sky.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
It's just fascinating. Let's keep a watching brief on this, Fred. I think, as you say, it is all the way out there, but it does impact our lives, and particularly how we communicate and how we learn more about space and our own planet.
Absolutely, yes. We don't realise how tied up we are with space technology. And a risk like this is actually quite a strange one, but it's a very real one.
Yeah. Professor in Physics and Head of the School of Mathematical and Physical Science, Fred Menk, thank you, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
It is fascinating, isn't it? We think it's so far away, but really it does impact so very much. 2NURFM, Meryl Swanson with you. Strikers Softball Club, they're having their summer registration tomorrow at 5 p.m. It's at Stevenson Park, Mayfield West. If you would love to have a game of softball this summer, or even T-ball, you can register tomorrow. 5 o'clock, Stevenson Park. Just turn up. 2NURFM, in touch with our community, thanks to our sponsor, Elders Real Estate.